in this for about a year now. Thank you, Robot Lady. Yeah, we've been hosting these for about a month or about a year now, once a month online, and just had it's been a really interesting mix of people who are building tools for thinking, people who are using tools in their job, and then people who are thinking about thinking. So we've had people thinking about neuroscience and mediums and exploring different things like that. So, and then in terms of the next couple of months, we're looking at doing some themed Tools for Thought Rocks meetings around the idea of infinite canvases. So there's a lot of interest in spatial interfaces right now across a bunch of different, you might call domains that are implementing spatial canvases. I think we'll try to be bringing together several, for each of those talks, we'll try to bring together several different spatial canvas authoring tools into a single talk that might even be crossing different domains, and just kind of see how those ideas can kind of cross-pollinate. So that'll be the next couple of months. In fact, I see Pol from Firma.ws is on here right now that are working on one of those spatial canvases as well, and was one of the people I was hoping to reach out to. So hopefully to gather those folks together and kind of share some best practices and learnings around those topics. But if you have other topics that you are interested in that relate to tools for thinking, please reach out to myself or Boris or Christina. If you have tools you'd like to explore, things you'd like to talk about, we're happy to do the work to push the buttons in Luma to manifest what an amazing group of 30 people we have to talk about this topic today. And then we can spend time gathering around those topics together. So I'm happy to see all of you here. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Christina.
I'll do one more short thing. So just to be very clear, Luma toolsforthought.rocks is what redirects to that Luma community. Anyone who joins the Luma community also doesn't have to wait for us to press the button. So scaling synthesis also means taking some ownership. We're happy to basically have you put things in the calendar as part of accessing this community. There's a few other tricks. You need to add one of us as a co-host so that we can invite previous people and a few other kind of nuances of Luma, the tool. But like literally also feel free to put in like a sample calendar event as part of like just learning Luma, basically. We found it a really useful tool. So feel free to like co-build this community with us. Christina.
Wonderful. That was great intro. Thank you. I'm super excited to being roped into this. I met Boris because I got roped into one of the early Tools for Thought sessions. I'm building social roots. My background is in ecology. I'm a knowledge ecologist, so I look at information flows in a similar way to a river ecologist looking at sunlight or nitrogen flowing through a system. And while you can't radioisotope tag an idea, you can begin to recognize structures that look like spawning grounds or other. I am in social roots, we're looking at how do networks, like Boris just indicated, actually go from, hey, I'm interested and aligned, to I want to step in into leadership and put an event on a calendar or step into action in some way. So we're building a communication tool for that. I'll put the link in the notes after this. And the thread on Twitter that sparked this conversation led to the discovery, my discovery. I hadn't seen Rob's work before, of scaling synthesis, which in my estimation is a perfect term for what a lot of people right now are trying to do in the face of all of the wicked problems that that face us right now. I was hoping to have a demo and actually make a Tools for Thought social roots node, but our backend engineer got COVID. So I'll, anybody who joins for early access, I will let everybody know as soon as we can, and we'll pull that in email too. Any other important context? I think Rob has a lot to get through, so let's hand it off. I'll moderate a little bit, and he's asked that people just come into the discussion as you are called. Yeah, Boris. You're muted though.
Just showcasing hand protocol. That's worked well for us in the past. So just stick up your hand / you're welcome to do text comments as well. And Christina can read it out if you don't feel like doing audio. So use what's comfortable for you.
Awesome. Take it away, Rob.
Okay, great. Let me get the screen share going. Hi, my name's Rob Haisfield. You can find me on Twitter. You may know me from there or from YouTube, where I've done lots of videos on tools for thought and done tours with people as they use them. Scaling synthesis is the name of the name we've given to our research project, and you can access the website here. So over the course of this talk, I'm going to cover a lot, and there's going to be a few areas where like you'll actually see a page referenced within the app that I'm using right now, and you'll be able to access that on the Scaling Synthesis website if you so choose. So anyway, like a little bit more background. So over the course of my career, I've been super passionate about tools for thought. I've designed a few extensions and made a lot of friends and acquaintances through the community. To give a little bit of background on the type of usage that I was into, I was a behavioral product strategy and gamification consultant, just like independently for a few years, right? So hypertext tools helped me to synthesize, right? I needed to synthesize behavioral science research alongside game design, alongside user research and just conversations with clients and all that, and deliver that into some form of insight. So these sorts of like graph-based tools have helped me to synthesize across many projects at once. I have, by the way, you can see my screen, right? Yes. Okay. I've seriously used many apps, including Bear, Notion, Roam Research, Obsidian, dabbled a bit in Logseek, and now I'm using Tana. So right now I just started yesterday full-time as a product manager for Tana. And the app that I'm presenting right now within that is Tana, right? So it's still like in closed alpha at this point. So there's like some little bits of quirkiness, so don't mind that, but that's what I'm using right now. Thanks to a grant from the Graph Foundation, I was able to take on bigger questions than I could as a hobbyist, so I've been thinking about this stuff loudly in public for a while, but I could only really do so much. So my collaborators were Joelle Chan and Brendan Langdon on this project. And our starting questions were, what workflows and behaviors facilitate synthesis? What are powerful interfaces for entering information into a discourse graph? What user behavior is required to maintain a discourse graph? How do we solve the problem of different people talking about the same thing with different language? That's something really that I found to be really important for the sake of synthesis, and I'll get into that more later. But then also, what user behavior, what are people doing already that implies structure that's not necessarily being instantiated into structure, right? So like, for example, in Rome, one of the things that they did that was really interesting is they noticed that the way people use outliners, even in like Microsoft Word, is that they'll indent things to nest ideas or build on ideas, right? And so they incorporated that into the data structure, and that you can query and filter by, and thus reduced the effort to structure information by a lot. So we wanted to find other things like that. And so, like these, I'm not going to cover all of these questions in this talk. You can see that they've got like these purple nodes, and they start with a Q. You can go to scalingsynthesis.com and find notes with those specific titles if you want to explore more. So we performed a non-exhaustive review of the literature and prior art, as well as some budding art as well, because we interviewed so we interviewed like 30 or so people who use tools for thought across like a variety of industries, as well as like 10 builders of tools for thought that are like still in progress. What do I mean by scaling synthesis? So synthesis, as we define it, is we're referring to a particular form of sense making, where the inputs are practical, scientific, or scholarly theories, findings, data, just some sort of evidence, and the output is a coherent intellectual whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And this can be really useful for guiding strategies, especially in unclear domains, and also for spurring conceptual innovation and advancing the state of knowledge on a subject. Some examples of synthesis include behavioral economics. You know, that was when Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and Richard Thaler all kind of realized that economists and psychologists were talking about the same thing with different language. They were all studying human behavior through different lenses, right? So they tried to synthesize those and thus birthed a new field, right? In my own work, I have had to combine behavioral science, game design, and product design, realizing that they all care about changing your digital environment to influence user behavior, and thus like trying to synthesize those findings and research methods. You know, and like a specific example of this, like subjectively, it's that feeling where everything comes together, you know, like if I'm working on a project, like in the past, I worked on a project called Guided Track. I, you know, synthesized the user research and also the behavioral science, and ended up with just like a plan. You know, I was like, this is how we're going to teach people the app. Everything's going to come together such that people learn it, right? And a common assumption is from builders is that the answer is to focus on individual synthesis, right? So empower individuals to synthesize better in their tools. And you have the expectation that distributed synthesis is going to happen out of band. So like just people talking to each other in the hallways on Twitter, like they don't care, right? Our research, instead, we wanted to scale synthesis to large quantities of people working towards common goals, and also large quantities of information. And just as a disclaimer as well, like this is just a small subsection of our research. Go ahead, Boris.
So do you have any details, or do you think of this as within one organization or cross-org, right? I'm trying to avoid just saying the word business. We're using organization as a superset of that. Maybe a little background on how you looked at that.
We were pretty open in our exploration there. You know, like we recognized that the idea of like a team of people synthesizing is very different than, you know, like an industry of people who don't really know each other synthesizing. And this research is very exploratory, you know, so we just set out to find whatever we could about multiple people working together on synthesis, or individuals working with large amounts of content.
We do. Let me just jump in with a question from the chat from Marc Antoine.
Sure.
Curious whether you'd whether and how you distinguish synthesis from abstraction. And while we're defining it, seemed like a good time to ask.
I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe we table that for later, and maybe Marc Antoine realizes how we're distinguishing it in our research. Okay, so I'm gonna get into a summary real quick of the talk, a quick overview of what we're going to get into. We want to scale synthesis to large amounts of people and information. Synthesis is hard to do with people who don't share context with you, because others often aren't speaking the same language and don't know what you're interested in. Because of this, we suggest find or create shared context. So specifically, we ended up exploring designing mechanisms to bring people up to speed, and especially mechanisms for lowering the barrier to add structure to notes and helping people learn the vocabulary of domain. And given that people often defer structure for later or not at all, we move forward through incremental formalization and structure in hindsight affordances. So we can let's get into some of the more specifics of this now. So synthesis is hard to do with people who don't share context with you. Others often aren't speaking the same language and don't know what you're interested in. So speaking the same language, Ryan Singer described in Shape Up, he described the instance and paraphrase, he was saying that synthesis with others only really occurs when you can cover a breadth of topics quickly. This can only happen if you're able to leave out details as you go. When you're on your own or with a trusted collaborator with shared context, you don't need to re-explain things you already understand. Like you can use a shorthand to communicate, right? So that shorthand might be like almost thought of as jargon too. So this is primarily about increasing information density in communication. You know, like we've all seen those videos on YouTube of people explaining a concept at 5 different levels. And you'll notice that, like, you know, when they're talking with children and teens, then they aren't really able to get into the weeds. They have to start from the basics. Whereas when they're talking to like grad students studying their subject matter or other experts, they're able to just like fly, you know, and we think that's a really cool thing. Francis Miller, who's also within the Tools for Thought community, explored this idea of organizing knowledge with multi-level content. And that's in a paper called that. And, you know, like what he did was he had the whole paper in a page. It was just summary of like all of the parts, right? Basically in bullet points. And then each of the 4 parts got a few pages, right? And then after he had done that for each of those parts, you know, like he actually got into the part itself. So the whole thing's like 90 pages, but you only really need to go through a little bit of it because he explains at multiple levels and you don't need to read everything, right? And so here we're going to say that compression facilitates synthesis. Intuitively, having blocks that are too large or complex would make reassembly into a new whole impractical or impossible. You know, so the most basic requirement is for synthesis is having appropriately sized blocks to start with, right? So it's like you can't just send a brain dump to other people, you know, and then expect them to synthesize it, right? Using it, you kind of need to like give them the high level chunks, right? And Andy Matuschak describes this idea of note titles as APIs. So the title of the note is able to substitute for the whole idea, you know, and you're able to compress a large amount of knowledge and ideas into just a sentence, right? And so this allows people to get a shorthand themselves, and that can actually increase their speed of communication, you know, because they get autocomplete for their own ideas, right? So the experience of this, if you're not super familiar with it, is like when you're reading on Kindle, you can highlight a term to see its definition, right? So we are arguing that we'd also like to see that applied to other things like claims, questions, evidence, sources, people. We found that those are all very helpful to introspect as well. You know, so like here I could even like click on compression facilitates synthesis and let's see. And I could show like the whole note. This is what's on the website, right? Like, you know, and that's just a stand-in. That's just a stand-in for the idea. Now, this is a pretty broad schema. It's not really domain specific, claims, questions, evidence, sources, but we found that it's a pretty basic thing that allows people to handle a discourse quite well. Yes, Christina?
I just, as we're diving into your research, I'm wondering if there was synthesis to what end? Like, were people doing synthesis together for all sorts of different reasons, to a purpose, to have that outcome, etc.?
Yeah,
Thanks.
we saw a variety of things because, like I said, we interviewed like 30 or so people from different industries. So some were synthesizing towards building products and coming up with a roadmap that would satisfy their users. Some would synthesize towards writing a research paper with a clear theory that they propose to the field. So all sorts of things. It's a great question. Okay. So synthesis is hard to do with people who don't share context with you because they aren't speaking the same language, but also because they don't always know what you're interested in. One of our participants gave an example where he was working on a knowledge graph research project with people who didn't know about knowledge graphs before, you know, so like they had been using, I guess, like Apple Notes prior, right? They didn't really know the history of the domain, didn't know, you know, what Xanadu was or what a relational or graph database was, right? So they had like 10 sources and divided them up. So each person would read different sources and take notes on them. But like when our subject would read the sources, he would like, he would take notes in the context of what they were looking for, right? You know, like it wasn't everything, whereas his other researchers would like take summaries of the entire note, right? So that would end up like overwhelming with poor signal to noise ratio by nature of not having an understanding of driving questions in history of the space, like a shared understanding between the people. They didn't have a good filter for relevance. So because of this, we suggest find or create shared context. So what does that mean? One solution is to simply connect people who share context, right? Like this remains an active area for further research, but obvious solutions include things like connecting people who write about similar concepts, right? Or enabling the formation of communities and querying the overlap between those. Like this is still something to explore, but if you want to see more details, I have a note on the website, how do you scale and distribute synthesis, where I go into the research on that a little bit more. There's also designing mechanisms for quickly bringing people up to speed. I noticed a question from Bill Seitz. Is there a list of interviews for sense of the context? No, so our interviews were anonymized, right? We may explore talking with various people to see about like de-anonymizing their interviews. They were all recorded, but like but the issue is like with trying to just like share notes, like screenshots and stuff without their names. You know, like you see the screenshots and you know their work, right? Like people were giving us a pretty good peek into like the sorts of things that aren't always super public. Anyway, so designing mechanisms to quickly bring people up to speed. In order to do this, we need to facilitate knowledge transfer between experts and beginners. As we noted earlier, experts often prefer to work on their own or with other people who already share context. Because that allows them to omit the basics. They don't need to add all that structure, right? So solutions to this involve helping people learn the vocabulary of the domain, lowering the barrier to add structure to notes, and improving exploratory browsing interfaces. The exploratory browsing interfaces, we're not going to get into that in this talk just because other research, this is like a very rich area of HCI research. So there's just other bases for it that are better. But going into helping people learn the vocabulary of the domain, we saw some interesting affordances there that I like a lot. So one is interactive intent modeling. There's a paper that is called as such, Interactive Intent Modeling for Exploratory Search. And so what you'll see in this image here is an interesting search interface, right? So you search for computer vision, and on the right, you see a list of ranked search results as you're used to seeing. But on the left, you see concentric circles, right? So at the center is you, and you have machine vision, and that's like the thing that covers the broadest amount of the search space. And on the outer rims, you see, like different clusters of keywords, right? And even just by looking at this, you start to realize all of the ways that people talk about the domain that you're looking into. Like a big problem in like learning a new domain is just knowing what vocabulary to use to query it, right? And I think that this is also a very important problem when you have multiple people who all have their own vocabularies synthesizing together. You want to give people like those sorts of ways to explore other people's vocabularies, right? And so what you can do is you can say like, okay, clustering, that's something I care a lot about in machine vision. So you would like grab the clustering keyword and bring it closer towards the center, and then it would change the ranked results on the right, and it would change the keywords that it showed to, again, represent like the space that you have filtered in on in all the ways that people might describe it. We also see interesting affordances in the way that Roam Research does filters. So here you can see that I have a page for mental model, and I'm looking through the linked references for mental models, and I'm able to filter those. So it shows me all of the other terms that I have linked to, in the context of mental models, right? And it shows, you'll actually see this number next to it too, that shows how many times. So it shows you like the strength of the connection. And then if I tap on tacit feedback loop to include that, you'll see, or if I tap on tacit knowledge to include that, you'll see that it actually changes the references it gives me to filter by, and it still shows by order of importance. So like now I know, oh, naturalistic decision making, heuristics and bias, and feedback loops, those are all terms within this domain, and so again, I think that's very important to help people learn the vocabulary. So then there's also lowering the barrier to add structure to notes, and this is where we get into a lot of the meat of the research. People often, the decision of how, when, and what to structure is a core problem for current thought processors. Most tools for thought require you to manually structure in the moment, which comes with a pretty big burden, right? So people often defer structure until later. So why do that? We have this note, why do people prefer to structure later or not at all? So one is it presently takes too much work to create structure. So what does that mean? In current tools, structuring ideas in real time is an extraneous task that takes you out of the flow of the work that you're doing. So that entails things like figuring out how a block fits into a pre-existing system or schema. That's costly. That takes mental effort, and especially if that schema is not your own, it's hard to fit. So that's a challenge for multiplayer synthesis, right? So deciding what to name things, deciding what folder to put it in, even autocomplete is a task switching thing where you're writing down your thought and then you start autocomplete and you switch from thinking your thought to selecting between options. And that's like a moment where you can lose the train of thought and be totally derailed. Additionally, people often don't know how to predict how they're going to reuse the note in the future. So it's hard to predict whether it's going to be worthwhile in the future. It's unlikely to. And so as a result of not being able to predict how you're going to use it in the future, that just means the cost benefit trade-off is like benefit unclear, cost clear. So I'm just not going to put in the effort to structure. Also, an increasing amount of structure leads to entropy. Like this claim's pretty simple. As you create more structured systems, it creates more work around maintenance, around figuring out how to fit notes into your current system. And if you don't fit notes into it, then that information often falls outside of the system, out of the cracks, and the system just collapses. People stop trusting it, and so you can't really use it. And, you know, there are just other reasons that deferring structure may be beneficial. It speeds up the researcher to focus on new information versus pre-existing knowledge. We discussed this earlier. It can structuring the data before you know the shape of structuring like a schema for a domain before you know the shape of it is limiting. Premature fixation can leave you in a, it can leave you, it can prevent you from exploring all the options that you should. So it can limit your creativity. And also structure is situational a lot of times, right? Like I structured all of my, I structured the notes from, you know, the research from the hypertext notebook for this presentation. I might structure it differently for Tana. I might structure it differently for a specific person. You know, you can see more by looking at our research resource formality considered harmful on the website. Okay. So what do we do about all of this?
Rob, can we
What do
just pause for
Sure.
just a second? There's so much information and there's lots and
Yeah.
lots in the chat.
Let's take some questions.
Is there anybody who wants to pipe up?
I think Boris was asking an interesting question.
Sure. One of the things that led Christina and I to think like, and then see Rob's stuff and be like, yes, our knowledge ecologist brains were like, this is what we need, is that we were talking about that age-old question of community building and tool selection, and thinking about the personas of the people that we might attract and what we could get them to adopt. What I put in the chat was this, this feels like a very expert process. A lot of my time is spent with people who don't use TFTs. I use them mainly personally. So my open question, which is literally your question as well, is scaling synthesis and maybe your thoughts on adoption. What is this? This feels like the deep end of the pool. Do you have any thoughts on the shallow end of the pool?
Right. Right. I think a large part of it's going to come from smart defaults, right? So you'll notice like at some points during the talk, I'll, when I'm discussing structure in hindsight, I'll talk about some affordances where, you know, an expert can get into the nuts and bolts and really change the semantic meaning of something. But at the same time, we want smart defaults, right? So one of the solutions I'm going to propose is replacing the backlinks for a page with a search, you know, and the user can edit that search in any way that they want. Now that imposes a lot of effort, and honestly, like backlinks are a pretty smart default for what's related to a page, you know, so let's just make the default search a search for backlinks, right? You know, you can edit it, get into the nuts and bolts, but like, but yeah, no, like in terms of getting more people that are not experts to use it, like that is a great question. One of the things that I have been focusing on thus far in the talk is how to make it easier for experts to get in that information without disrupting their flow. But then on top of that, you know, like that implies a bunch of things, right? Like if we get into structure in hindsight, that's something that can happen not just by you, but that can happen through other people, you know. So I think that capturing the potential energy, it's going to be important to capture the potential energy of everybody just consuming information. So that would entail things like using trail marks, maybe using something like World Brain Memex that allows you to have communities of people annotating information together towards shared collections and stuff. But yeah, no, that's a great question. I know some few more. Go ahead, Mark Antoine.
No, I just saw Alexander had his hand before me, so.
Okay, Alexander.
Go.
Thank you. So several years ago, I was actively using Google Keep for note taking, and I found out that it actually doesn't fit my needs. So it has lack of dark theme, and it is hard for me to hashtag everything, because in Ukrainian keyboard layout you don't have a hashtag symbol.
Mhm.
So it's just shows that developers who were creating this app were like English speaking, natively English speaking, because in any other layout hashtag is not present. So
Mhm.
just changing the keyboard layout to press this hashtag symbol to insert hashtags derails my thought. And that's why I created my own note-taking app, where you just type a message, and you can click on every word and it will be searched. And so you generate a new search, and then you can jump between thoughts just clicking on any word in your notes.
Mhm. So you click on a word and it generates a search for that word. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Did I gather that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah. Linus Lee presented something on Twitter a while ago that I really liked, which I think he called it hyperlink maximalism, but the general idea was like literally every word in your notes and every phrase could be thought of as a search, or as like a hyperlink, right? So like a hyperlink is just an extremely specific search, you know? And so if people don't generate those manually, he wanted people to be able to like highlight a section and then it would generate a semantic search for him and pull up those results. So like I think that stuff like that reduce the need to structure it all are very important. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually like idea to everyone who develops an app similar for tools for thought to just think of other people who has other languages as their native, and so keyboards are not everyone. Not everyone has the same keyboard.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah,
That's a good
that's
point.
it.
Yeah, so that even means that stuff like Markdown, like just the notation that you use can influence how people structure. Bill Seitz said, I think avoiding structure is the wrong frame. Delaying structure seems better. Yeah, I would agree with that in large parts. But I do think reducing the need to structure in the first place is important. I would say like delaying structure for later, so what we refer to as structure in hindsight, can also be thought of like declarative structure, right? It's like you put all of this information into your notes. Like I should be able to generate structure on demand, you know, for what I need. But the thing about it, you know, is like, let's say you take Linus Lee's hyperlink maximalism approach of like, you don't need to manually do any link. It's all through these semantic searches. The issue with that, as compared to a tool like Tana, Rome, Obsidian, is that just the act of like naming these blocks and use so that you can reference that gives you something that makes it easier to create structure in hindsight. And it also means that you're more likely to use the same terms over and over again, right? So it's like, I mean, I think there's a balance, but like, I think that a lot of people just aren't going to do the structure. So we need either like software to help with that, or we need other people to help with that. Marc-Antoine?
Yeah, I really no. This is a fascinating conversation. First, 100% in progressive formalization. It's at the core of my own approaches. And Boris was asking just in the chat, is structure opinion? And structure is a model. Structure is curation. Structure is editorial. That's the chat conversation, and that means there are multiple possible structurations of any given piece of information. And That's why I'm also not for automate everything, because it's the uncurated with all the mistakes there are. Whereas if you allow curated, on the other hand, it means that you have to admit the fact that there's multiple points of view and multiple curations, and make that multiplicity explicit. I really like the example you showed where you start with a search and then you say, well, this is how I want it here, and this is how I want to change the keywords. And that should be remembered because you've added information about your viewpoint, and that's relevant. But I first raised my hand to respond more to the initial point about expertise. The point about expertise is there's this case of the experts who are working together and they have a shared context and they have flow because the shared context is already there. There's the point of these people who are learning the context and need to come up to speed with them. And I think you covered those two very much. And there's the point of people who have different viewpoints and need to align vocabularies, which is a totally, yet again, another process. The ideal tool cannot exist because it has to serve all those needs, like the learning path, the flow path, and the alignment path. And that means we have to have at least modalities on our tools. I think an ecosystem of tools, but these are related things.
Yeah, I'd like to point out one thing there. You say like reconcile the beliefs of different people. This is part of why also I think that like having this general structure of saying like, okay, here are claims, questions, evidence, like that sort of thing, right? And like treating those as the addressable pieces, as opposed to something like a blog post or, like a term. There's like lots of keyword term mentions, right? But that's not as useful, right?
I agree totally.
If you have claims, you can like, multiple people can say, I agree or disagree with this claim, or, you can have multiple people answer the same question and then people come together on that. I actually like just yesterday or the day before put the scaling synthesis research, like it's on its website, right? But it's also on Agora right now, and perhaps Flancian can give some more details at some point, right? But my impression is that if you create a page referencing the same title of like a page that I've created, then you can like directly address that claim or question and think through it together. Yeah.
1000%. Thank you.
Okay. I want to keep going, but if people who have questions right now wouldn't mind like writing down their questions so we can keep going, but just have a couple more subjects to get through real quick. So given that people often defer structure until later or not at all for a variety of reasons, how do we move forward? One way is through incremental formalization, supported by rich mechanisms for resurfacing information. So incremental formalization means like instead of adding all of your structure ahead of time, you add it bit by bit, right? So maybe while you're writing a note down, you add a little bit of structure, but then it gets resurfaced at some point and you add a little bit more, right? This is going to reduce the pressure to incorporate notes into your system as you're writing. And, like we see this everywhere. This is a common pattern, right? Like there's a game called Dwarf Fortress that is a notoriously large code base and simulates accordingly like 40% of reality, or at least the interesting bits in their words, right? But like this guy's been working on the code base for decades at this point, and every time he revisits like a file or like a function or something, he'll like edit it a little bit to make it just a little bit more clear and a little bit more useful at that point, right? So we see this pattern outside of just knowledge management as well. So I want to go into mechanisms that Tools for Thought can use to resurface old info. One way is through manual queries. So this includes like searching through backlinks for a page, or even just writing your own search. This is powerful, especially given like a strong query language like Jess made a point earlier, you don't need to structure if you can have search. I would agree with that in a lot of ways. You're going to see how I use search as the basis for a lot of things, right? But again, it can't be manual because a lot of people just aren't going to think to do it, and it's going to take effort. So what I really like, though, are auto-generated queries. So these are contextually relevant to your current context. They require no extra effort. They just happen like as you're writing or as you're visiting something. Downside is that they are potentially distracting. But that distraction can be a good thing depending on how you look at it. So I'll go into a few examples. One is World Brain Mimics. What they do is they let you annotate the web, highlighting, commenting, bookmarking. And if you search in Google, it will also show you on the side other results from your collection, right? So that's one way to passively resurface information. We also see Twemex, and that's a browser extension. And so when you go to a person's page, for example, you're going to see an auto-generated query for their tweets that have over 25 likes sorted by most liked, right? It can also generate a query for you of conversations that you've had with that person too. These are things that like expert users would do manually. And this just gives that power and flexibility to average users. Thread Helper is another browser extension for Twitter. And as you're writing out a tweet, it will search for other tweets within your history that might be relevant for you to quote tweet. So here, like you'll see in the tweet that I'm writing, I mentioned continuous onboarding, feedback loops, and learnability, and it's it's like finding things that are matches for that I could quote tweet. And then also, this was something I proposed for the Rome Games onboarding challenge a while back that I think still is underappreciated and I really want to see implemented in Tools for Thought. But basically it's like, as you're writing, you'll notice that you like link to multiple entities, within your outline, right? And so this would be able to look at where your mouse is in the outline and auto-generate a query for notes that reference the same entities. And you'll see here, I even have a slider for how many of them have to match. So I could say like any two of my dog, exercise partner, grateful for, or journal, those have to match, right? So you can see how that might be useful in a wide array of contexts where you're thinking through a subject. Christina, you have a question?
Yeah, I've seen a few things in the chat about divergence and convergence, and I hear my dad in the back of my head saying, read once for understanding and then for critique. Sort of that question that Boris had is structure opinion, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see anything in the research where the flow of thought was clearly about input, discovery, sort of taking things in and learning, versus an effort of meaning making or synthesis that felt like a different flow of work, or did they happen simultaneously?
I would say that those are just stages in the process, and they can happen simultaneously. Joel could actually give more context if he's willing to jump in real quick on the sense making loops.
Can you repeat the question?
No problem. There's been a lot of discussion in the chat about whether or not divergence and convergence can happen simultaneously effectively. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, in the research, if you saw sort of a different texture of the flow of work when people were doing divergent or discovery work versus synthesis work, and if you could talk to that at all. Like, did they often combine divergence and convergence, and is that troublesome for sense making, or is that generative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think of the divergence convergence possibly mapping to the sort of axis of less structure versus more structure. It's a lot easier to structure, sort of apply a category to convergent things. Like I already know what category this expense I'm filing is going to go into, versus I see this new observation. I don't really know what it means. Does it relate to this concept? Is that concept? Is it a new concept altogether? In those cases, it's often more divergence. They're exploring lots of different ways to think about things. And consistently what we see with our, and I'll speak a little bit to the context of most of the people we're interviewing are what we can think of as knowledge workers. So we had lots of researchers, lots of people doing strategy, lots of people sort of pushing the boundaries of thinking. And so often what they're doing is they're exploring, right? They're trying to figure out what is the case. And in those settings, trying to structure felt like premature convergence, because they're trying to apply a category to something that wasn't quite formed yet. And so that was one of the reasons that they expressed as delaying the structuring, because they couldn't predict what this meant. They couldn't predict very well where it would go. And so it wasn't the right time to do that. And so they didn't structure. But often it never came, just like Maggie said in the chat, like the structuring never came. And so that's one problem, but also in the process of doing that divergence, it was very expensive to connect with other people, because there's not handles for other people to jump into, which may be inherent to the nature of this divergent work. But that's one of the questions of this research, right? Is that an inherent limitation of doing this kind of thinking, or are there things our tools can do to help us add structure in this kind of setting? So yeah, to answer your question, I guess more concisely, the typical pattern that we saw with our interviewees was a lot of divergence first, and then struggling to converge later on.
Yeah. And then also there were like multiple stages of it too, you know, like you'd have people like in their divergent research for a while, and then they like compile that into like an outline or a document, and then they continue, and then they recompile into a more concise one, or one that like is making the point that they want to make. Marc-Antoine, you have a question?
No, more a comment on this convergence divergence. I think it depends a lot if you're talking about phases of work for teams, where teams can be all the time convergent together, divergent together. But in asynchronous tools, it's a totally different dynamic, because some people can be divergent while others are divergent, and it shouldn't matter. So what's important is more, can I read the content with a divergent or convergent mindset, more than, you know, does it favor this being convergent together, being divergent together, which may or may not be important. Where I do believe the team aspect matters a lot is when you're trying to be convergent, you're imposing structure, then you want to crowdsource the work of progressive formalization. So not everybody has to formalize the same thing, unless there is a divergence in the formalization, and then you want to be aware of that. and because that's also means there's meta convergence needed. Over.
Totally. I'm going to jump back into this because I just have a little bit more to get through. And then it should be good. So far, methods of resurfacing so that you can have incremental formalization, manual queries, auto-generated queries. You can also have recommendations from a friend, you know, like on Twitter, someone maybe finds an old tweet of yours and likes it, that brings it back into your attention. And then there's also intervals and random resurfacing, right? So like the problem with auto-generated queries is that they're contextual and topical. So it's still going to be sort of like what comes to mind normally, you know, but like if you want to have a broader understanding of like what you have available to you, you know, like you can have mechanisms like spaced repetition or randomness, you know, like show me 5 random notes every day, right? And that's going to be independent of goals. Okay. And then structure and hindsight. structure in hindsight, I'm going to just jump straight into search as a primitive. So again, like we can replace the backlink section of a page with a related items section. So like if we look at a page as having contents and then a list of related items, that related items is generally backlinks for people. We can have a smart default and just say that like let's replace that backlink list with a search. The default is a search for backlinks because that's generally going to be useful, but the user can manually edit that query. And we want to make that the basis for a lot of things, right? And we want to make that composable. So let's look at this. So like search terms as the basis for user-defined subscriptions, right? So let's say I want to see everything Joelle Chan writes about behavioral science, right? So I have a query for all, and don't take this query language too seriously, right? Like this is just me writing something down for my own sake. It could even be semantic searches as a way of specifying this, but I'm just doing this here. So written by Joelle Chan and behavioral science. And then, but like we've also defined behavioral science further elsewhere as having a different query, right? And so that query is looking for any time I've mentioned behavioral science, cognitive science, psychology, or neuroscience, right? And so then look at how much structure I just created in like a very short, written by Joel Chan and behavioral science. Like that, the behavioral science comes with so much more meaning than it did before. And then, you know, like maybe I want to see everything written by the Tools for Thought Rocks group about synthesis or sense making. And here, you know, I've defined the Tools for Thought Rocks people elsewhere, you know, as including like Boris, Christina, Jess, Bill, you know, like non-exhaustive list, of course, but like you get the point, right? It becomes this really composable thing. Then I can create my own news feed too, where I like, let's say I define followed people as Tools for Thought Rocks people and Web3 people. And then define followed interests as behavioral science, tools for thought, or synthesis, any of the following. Muted authors is defined as just Joe Rogan. I don't have any others for now, but maybe I'll add more later. And then a news feed. And then a news feed would be followed, just like this query right here, followed people, followed interests, and not any of my muted stuff, right? So what I really like about this, again, is just like how much ability it gives people to create structure in hindsight. If you're able to just like compose queries together, it's like if you've ever used smart folders, you know, in Apple, but like you can start composing those together. Lets you create structure on demand. And then, you know, you can even do this for like more complex questions, right? So like, let's say I'm trying to figure out what's the difference between how a novice and an expert uses the terminal. And here I have a query for any time I've mentioned mental model, tacit knowledge, feedback loop, or model of expertise in conjunction with any time I've mentioned new user or power user, right? And so what's nice about this, right, as opposed to like, let's say I turned this into just a question entity and I start referencing that question and I'm just looking through the backlinks, that's not going to have everything, you know, like, because I've done so much work on the subject prior to even coming up with that formalization of the question. And the composable searches are able to bring that in more specifically. Without extra effort for going back and having to tag something up fresh. Anyway, that is all I have for the talk. So I'd love to just engage in an open conversation at this point.
A round of jazz hands applause. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
As I joked in the video, now we need the version of this recording which just scrolls the chat log linked to time codes. Multimedia. Questions, comments.
Oh,
I have
come
some
on, don't be
questions
so
for the
polite.
audience if no one has questions. but,
Yeah, what are your questions?
One question I have is generally how we could divide up the roles of synthesis, right? So here, here I describe how other people, like you can divide up the community roles, you know, so like you might have people who curate knowledge, who connect knowledge, educate, who bring in new research, or who like debate other people. And, you know, so I just question whether y'all are able to identify more roles that like software could specifically address.
It's Bono's hats, right? I think you have a lot of the base ones, the contrarian, the researcher. The connector is really important, and I think this is not one role. It's somebody who sees the connection and somebody who qualifies the connection, and that way the role that you kept talking about all the time is the person who adds structure. But also the person, the mediator, the person who mediates between conflicting structures.
Mm.
I think some of this really, I'm really trying to start at the beginning and think about setting the stage of there's an identified need. There's some group of people who are like, we're going to adopt a tool.
Yeah.
We're going to do some things. We have a hypothesis of what we need to do. And then we're going to invite in another set of people who we don't expect to have the same familiarity with the tool, for sure. We may provide some training. We may try some education. We may provide weekly check-ins or daily stand-ups or whatever it is, cadences,
yeah,
to help people do the thing. Yeah, like there's this whole arc there. Some of this makes me think of the classic social media numbers of or social network numbers of the 90, the 9, and the 1%. So the 1% of people who are super active, who do the things, who create the structure, the 9% who will leave comments and engage a bit with that, and then the 90% who are really relatively passive lurkers or consumers. I know Bill hates the word engagement, but depending on the context of attempting to scale synthesis, you would want to do that.
And I just have an anecdote about this. I was working with somebody who worked in large groups on listservs at the time. And he saw this 90, 10, 1% of, you know, the very active contributors, the more occasional contributors, and the readers. And he said a lot of people want to focus on the contributors, and then they realize that the proportion reestablishes itself in the subgroup, because the reality is the audience is attracting the contributors, and it's not a purely passive role. And also he found that maintaining, like he would have synthesis posts as a way to allow people who don't follow the whole thing to get, okay, here's what's happening. And that would engage the readers into participation often. It would provoke the readers into participating. So these roles are not fixed, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great point about how the audience can make it feel worthwhile, right? And it's but I would also say that like I think there's just like design affordances that still need to be done, you know, in terms of like prompting user behavior towards greater participation, right? Yes. I haven't figured that out yet. fully. But I think you just have to make it really easy and also worthwhile. Worthwhile too. Yeah, like one of the big things that I wanted to do with this talk was identify some of the big problems that people face when they try to synthesize together. And so that opens up for other solutions than what we propose, right, too. But yeah, one of the very frustrating and almost hilarious things too was just how few people we talked to said that they had synthesized with other people. So it's still an open, like, there's still a lot more research to do than what we did because of how few people we were even able to find that said that they did it.
Right.
But yeah,
Which itself says a lot, right?
and it makes me wonder if like that's like the software issue, because like the thing is, when I'm talking about like ways to give people to add structure to make their thoughts more inspectable by others and easier to engage with altogether, like I'm trying to beat HTTP. Like people can already post blogs and their own websites, and you can already like respond to another blog with your own blog and hyperlink to it, but like clearly there's something missing there from what we're going for.
The people who do synthesis all the time are facilitators. They are the community to go to for concrete experience. I was thinking about your roles, and I started saying teacher, somebody who makes sure there's an onboarding ramp for the outsiders, but also somebody who will be willing to mentor an outsider who really wants to learn. And that's a very important role, like people who maintain the continuity in time of the community. And I think what's really, really important is there's a time where you're willing to pull back, have perspective, open up, do the epistemological, why do I really believe this? And why couldn't it be otherwise? And that cannot be all the time. You have things to do. And that's why you delay the alignment, which is difficult. But that is something that is a very social activity. It's not just a matter of affordance. It has to be people choosing and committing to that inner stance. It's not just a technicality. It's a social process. And I think we have to realize yes, we need to build the tools, and I'm 100% scaling synthesis, our like most facilitation techniques we have work for in person. So, medium scale group. We want to expand it to large scale group, but that means new tools. But the whole social technology behind the facilitation meeting is still relevant. Because that's about creating this disposition where people are willing to suspend their beliefs a bit.
Yeah, totally. In someone, it might have been you, mentioned the role of the facilitator as well. One of the people that we talked to is a product manager, and I'm going to describe his story because he's talked about it publicly on Twitter as well. But what he'll do is he has like tons of like fill in the blank statements that he'll have his team, like he'll show up to his team and he'll show them a list of fill in the blank statements, have everybody write their own answers to it, and then come together to discuss from there. And I think that, it's John Cutler, Bill. And it's just excellent. And the thing is, like, you can actually sort of do that in these sorts of tools. So like I could do X, Y, like if X, then Y, and then each person writes their own thing underneath, like one answer, two answer, and then eventually, like once the group has come together and maybe like talked through it or like voted through some solutions, they could do like just sub that in where the block reference was, you know, that sort of thing. I think like you could have tools have more explicit support for that. You could even like describe a search that might fill in the answer. You know, but it's but that's a big part of also why like I'd really just love if people went on to like Agora, took the questions that I put on there, you know, and wrote their own answers to those questions. Lansing, you want to go ahead?
Yes, I guess I have a question. Thank you so much for the talk. It was amazing, very interesting. I guess two questions. I guess. So one is, how do you see your research continuing, and whether you see scaling synthesis as a coordination point to actually continue that research as a community, using those, using any tools in particular, or what you have in mind. And the other will be, I guess, in a different direction, which is, you know, going back to the how to potentially coordinate in such a way as the, you know, different roles actually interplay in a constructive way in a shared graph or some other structure. Whether you have thought of like I don't like the term perhaps, but killer apps, you know, in the sense of like, or perhaps like a minimum viable well, product. I also don't like product there perhaps, but you know, like some end goal that could actually motivate all the different roles in a community to essentially synthesize as a sort of like a experiment, right? To actually drive and motivate the research, perhaps.
Yeah. So to answer one, I plan on continuing to publish on it and on the website, continue to add to the repository. And I'd love for people to continue to respond to it, either through tweet threads or, you know, through Agora, in conversation there. And I also plan to apply as much as I can convince the rest of the team to let me apply scaling synthesis to Tana. You know, so I'm hoping to see these sorts of like primitives move forward there. To answer your second question, what was the second question again?
The second question, I guess, was like, let me see, try to summarize, whether you see an opportunity for any particular like kind of synthesis or project that could actually like let a community use synthesis for a particular goal and perhaps, you know, facilitate, because it's work, right? Synthesis is work, right. In particular, as you need to, like you said, achieve this shared context, build it, communicate it. When you have a goal in mind, a specific goal, perhaps that work becomes like a better investment for the people involved.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I don't know what the specific goal would be, but I do think that people sharing a common goal is a great starting point for this, especially like on a tricky problem that they're trying to solve. You know, because you can really put all this stuff in, and you know, in addition to claims, questions, evidence, and stuff. Like I also like to use decisions. They just fall a little bit outside the discourse structure, but like it can be. But like just this act of being formal with this stuff can make it a lot easier to make forward progress. You know, so I'd love to see that. Andrew, you want to go ahead?
Oh, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about structuring and actually automating structure, because recently I've been playing with GPT-3. It was just an amazing thing that you give it the text and it's just break down the text into the very basic component. So I was thinking, I got a lot of like, you know, ongoing notes and, you know, things comes to my mind on the go. And then after that, I need to structure it. I use ROM, so I just spend a lot of time placing it here and there. And I was thinking, is it possible to automate this stuff? Because I usually use the same structure, and it would be so amazing if I could just dump out everything I think. And when I get home and go to my computer, I would see pretty neat structured, and all of my thoughts are already like in some kind of form. And I was just like, oh my God, I just saved myself so much time. What do you think? Is it possible now? Maybe there's just like project been researching this part.
So if even just with like basic searches and stuff, right? Treat search as a primitive, and you can say like, based on these text patterns, I want you to, if it falls into these text patterns, add a new tag onto it, you know, like stuff like that, right? You can automate those sorts of things based on searches. But then also like just GPT-3 in particular, a very interesting use case that I found recently is that like I could, you know, I can write out like I was looking into internal family systems and as like a therapy method, and it's like, hey, here's a bunch of different parts of you, you know, that can go into your psyche, right? So I wrote out a description of one of those parts. I wrote out like, you know, when does it take control a situation? When is it useful a situation? When is it harmful a situation? And then I was like, generate a bunch more, or I was even like, take this paragraph and turn it into a markdown table. And I was able to get it to complete that. I was also able to get it to complete like turning it into different forms of structured data, like just by filling out the formatting for doing that within logseq with attributes. I was able to get it to reformat into that. So, you know, like one thing that I'd be really excited about would be like, you can take a screenshot of something, just like screenshot a tweet, describe how to get its metadata in, and then screenshot a bunch more tweets, and then it would transform that for you into the structured format that you want. Cool. Clancy has another question.
No, I forgot to actually lower my hand, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Christina, we've got about 10 minutes to wrap up. Where do you want to take us?
Well, I think that there's an underlying question that I have of how do I say this? The internet is so young. We're really learning how to do this, and we make so many assumptions based on what we've known that are, and those habits of behavior, those habits of learning, those habits of sharing information are largely entrenched in the power structures that a lot of us are fighting to change. And I wonder if it might be more engaging, not to get shot by Bill with the word engaging, but like lower the barrier of entry if you actually center this idea of we are looking at tools for thought to distribute power, to change the dynamics that are in place as conversations occur, data is created, and power is accumulated. Because when you, like that thread way up in the chat somewhere about, it's not really about the tools, it's about the data that is made and the retrievability of that data. That is how a lot of the internet centralization powers are pulling power together. So I guess I'd love to hear anybody who is talking about tools for thought with that goal of not just abstractly decentralizing the web, but actually like distributing power to real people in real places. If that's something that the people here have rub elbow with, if not done in their own work.
I'm happy to go if you don't mind. Yes. So I am this group I'm in, this collective. We are definitely seeing this as a priority for the group and just for communication with other groups. This is like within this context, mostly within cooperatives. Perhaps as with cooperatives as a way to distribute power back to the people, but also just like as a experiment, an experiment ground essentially to discuss these ideas and perhaps make them also useful to other organizations. But in general, the one term that perhaps I would like to bring up to discuss, or like perhaps in a future session, is that of the commons, I guess, the knowledge commons, as perhaps the basic, abstraction that could actually let us, move beyond what tends to be pushed consciously or unconsciously by many tools in this space, which are very geared towards the individual. And even as they tackle like the community aspects, they tend to do so in this quite, closed way, without actually extending, say, for example, like governance or the resulting graphs, or exchange of the resulting graphs to like what could be the commons. This, and this goes, ties into this issue of like, how does this relate to the reality of the internet as it is, and the internet as it could be, or was, and will be, right? So yes, I guess I know I discussed it with Rob as well. Well, when we had our interview, this to me, as I perform my very amateur unstructured research as well over the last few years, the knowledge commons will be the umbrella term I found to have this discussion in a meaningful way. I don't know if other people, if you resonate with this.
Yuri, go ahead.
I would love to hear Joel first, please. I would just like you to respond to what you say, but I'm so interested in what Joel would say.
Oh, I think isn't Mark ahead of me?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Christina, I love that that call to action. I think like one of the interesting implications of the scaling synthesis work is thinking about this sort of models that are being a bit more reflective about the power structures inherent in our models. So for instance, if we say, in order to substantiate a claim or some argument, you have to cite peer-reviewed journal articles, right? So that's the notion of support for your argumentation that's ingrained in a particular power structure for how knowledge is produced. But if you use a ontology that's based on, say, questions, claims, and evidence, and you think about evidence as any observation that is produced by some method, even if the method is as simple as I stood here and I did this thing for 5 days and then I saw this, that opens up the conversation to all the stuff that's happening on, say, like Reddit, subreddits, for example. People are experimenting with like different sleep patterns, and there's all this like amazing information that's just locked out of the conversation in terms of synthesis, because if we only think of claims and sources, right? So I'm excited about sort of shifting the conversation to enable these kinds of reasoning, and being critical about how do we think about what claims we think are supported versus not. Does it have to be like expert written? If we sort of like shift the focus to how do you know, and anybody can run an experiment, anybody can make an observation, and we can sort of synthesize across all the things and talk less about is this a peer-reviewed article by researchers from Harvard versus what did they actually do to make this observation, and why do we think this? I'm excited about things like that.
Okay. Can I jump in now? Thank you. I think got to be very brief. So first, this is an amazing collection of people, everybody here that I care about and rate most. But Christina, if it wasn't, well, before Mark and Jack, but if it wasn't for you 2 years ago, whatever it was, actually connecting me on LinkedIn, I wouldn't be here. I would have gone back to do my work because it just didn't work. And then you opened up, and then Dig Life Collective, and then the Tech We Trust. And I think your direction is the right. Okay, you said the internet is young. Well, actually, Ted Nelson said right at the beginning, at the very first World Wide Web conference, saying your future is in my past. we really got to go back to those ideas, and there is a real revolution, as you all understand, the IPFS new protocol for the web. So it is now possible. Ideas that were pre-web, like Steve Jobs' interpersonal computing networks, thanks to fission and all that convergence stuff, is now possible. And this, because this is, I mean, we talk about users. No, these are individuals who make use of tools. And we really we got to shift our viewpoint. As long as we're talking about users and products we've done, as Boris says, you know, we really need common-based, peer-produced capabilities, open, common-based, and we should solve these problems like interchange and interoperability. Interoperability is not enough. We really need to be interchange every capability ever used, because they should come to us. Okay, we shouldn't be flocking to those things that then silo. Or are they? Oh, that's another thing. Don't data, Jaralania says, is just people in information, is just people in disguise. You know, stop disguising ourselves. That really, and this really links to what Boris was saying. Really, there's another thread going on, the future of computing, isn't it? And these two really need to meet. Because the only way we solve that, so it's not just scaling synthesis, we really need co-created, evergreen, co-evolving synthesis, which is life for everybody, and the participants participate the way they do. So that's my speech, and thank you very much. Yeah.
Further on this point of like redistributing power through knowledge graphs too, and also going back to Plantian's question about like what's the killer, like what are killer use cases and sources of motivation. I think that like social networking can be a great
people's networking. Sorry, people's networking, not social networks.
Yeah, like generally what I'm saying is that I really think that the thing that scales synthesis to many people is going to look a lot more like a people network. You know, it's going to synthesize people networks and knowledge networks, because it also goes back to like what Marc-Antoine was saying about how like the 1% of contributors do it because of the 10% of people who engage with that, you know, like that social motivation is a big part of why people would contribute in the first place. And you can tie that, like their contributions to the person, such that that reputation is durable and builds. Alexander, what do you have on your mind?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I built actually a bunch of tools for, and basically they are all tools for SOT. So I have a notes app, and I have a project where you can actually create your code, like a structure editor for code. So regarding future of coding community, so I'm there also. And recently, I just realized that best tool for SOT for me is actually pen and paper. Like really, I cannot think about anything if I don't write it down. So I cannot abstract over and of some topic without writing it down. So I just spent like 2 weeks to creating a simple drawing app for an Android tablet. So where I can just like it mimics just pen and paper. That's it. It's the simplest app you can actually create. But I think it will work for me. And regarding your initial question, how we can distribute power from large organizations to people, it's actually I think that to create apps that allow you to store your own data on your own devices. And then you can probably communicate with other people we have some federated network. Like I'm not sure, like that's replacement for Twitter. Yeah, okay. There's a federated like open source Twitter-like network, and in such fashion, you can create something about RDF or graphs or knowledge graphs. So that's it. Thank you.
Yes, actually I'll respond to that first. This sharing information is something we've known how to do forever. It doesn't mean that we have a shared knowledge or a shared synthesis. I think what's really important, that I'm really happy that Rob focused on, first, what's the definition of synthesis? Because I can create my graph, you can create your graph, we can share them. We don't have a synthesis. And what we've observed with information sharing, and Jerry was perfectly rightly castigating the social networks, is it's been allowing for information bubbles. Like when you scale, it's easy to stick with the community with a shared context, stay in your bubble, and not have to go outside your bubble and confront your views. So the whole question of how do we scale the social process of confronting your views. I've just started reading a fascinating book. Recently, there was a book on how minds change, which is pop science, but interesting. But it got me on one of its sources, which is The Enigma of Reason by Hugo Mercier. And it goes into reasoning as a primarily social and interactionist process. Absolutely fascinating how many of our so-called cognitive biases are actually optimized for social cognition. And again, the question, how can we scale social cognition to the scale of deliberative democracy, to the scale where any social decision is thought about and contributed to by all citizens? And that's the real power distribution question. And that means we have to think about synthesis, on-ramp, and all these questions about how do we get people to create the social stance of openness. That's part of it. It's not just a technical question. Over.
As I said in the comments, and for those that don't know, Social Roots is the product name that Christina is working on, but it's actually a co-op called Wicked Problems co-op, so designed to do exactly those things. And I always think about this as, you know, I spend a lot of time in a lot of different communities trying to share context, trying to share learnings I've had in my past so that people don't have to repeat the same mistakes in different ways. And I think that's the underlying, like, why are we doing this? You know, I forget who said it, right? I think Rob might have said it at the beginning. Christina and I have been on calls where literally we just talk really fast because what we're trying to do is push context into each other's brains so that we can get to the interesting stuff on the other side of the shared context. And of course, this is what we're trying to do at larger scales to be able to tackle wicked problems.
And honestly, that tackling is the only reason I'm here. Like,
Right.
I might have studied something entirely different if I was born at a different time, but I was born at however many ppm, and we face what we face. And I think that's the motivating factor for me all the way down the stack.
Christina, shall we, any final thoughts? I want to hit the stop recording button. Flancy, I'll let you go as well, but I want to actually at least stop the recording. As everyone, Christina, are you okay with that? Anything else you want to slip in at the end?
I just want to say I'm so excited to continue a scaling synthesis series and expand and stay in touch with this community and expand this community so that there's larger diversity of faces as well as patterns of thought in the room.
Awesome.